the mental health of our children. That's really where I locate the mental health crisis, and where it's most obvious that we have in depression, anxiety, existential angst, a disconnect, confusion, inability to thrive across a third, maybe, of the population, a third of the population struggling, and then the numbers of people that are really flourishing arguably are smaller, especially in the younger generation. It's tragic and brutal. So if you're talking well-being, what is well-being? Well, psychological well-being, we can talk about whatever that term means. We need a metapsychology to clarify it. But oh my gosh, depression, anxiety, lack of satisfaction, disconnection, loneliness, it's unbelievably important to the human condition, and we're seeing that our society's trajectory on it is disastrous.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Integral Wellbeing podcast, where we explore the true causes of well-being from an integral perspective. I'm your host, Timo Peters, and today my guest is Dr. Gregg Henriques, Professor of Psychology at James Madison University, where he led the combined integrated clinical and school psychology doctoral program, kind of a mouthful, for 12 years, which is arguably one of the leading programs in integrative theory and training for psychotherapists. Gregg is probably most well known for his innovative work on creating a unified theory of psychology and a unified approach to psychotherapy, which is sorely needed in a field where fragmented schools and approaches are constantly competing for dominance in a way. So his unified approach to the study and healing of the mind is also embedded in a broader theory of knowledge, unified theory of knowledge that Gregg has been developing and which very recently came out in book form. So congratulations on that too, and welcome to the podcast.
Hey man, thank you. Got to pull it out. That's right. This is still hot off the presses for me. I got it last week. UTOK, the Unified Theory of Knowledge. This basically is the overview of the operating system. So I'm happy to have that now as part of the library, as it were. So it's exciting.
Yeah, and it's a gorgeous work too. I just got it digitally, unfortunately, but even then, the illustrations are just gorgeous.
Shout out to Christian Gross, who is sort of the groundskeeper of the UTOK garden and the graphics developer. And I know I'm very happy with the overall look. He that was part of the construction of it. We were in concert, and he's like, "I've got a whole new way of." I want the new graphic look. We also did a website, maybe we'll put up, and that's actually got a different flavor, more futuristic flavor for it. But we're sort of unveiling different themes and aesthetics for UTOK, because it's certainly not supposed to be grounded in fact, the first tree I did was a PowerPoint, the Tree of Life PowerPoint. So we need to grow in sophistication, and Christian Gross is helping with that for sure.
Wonderful. Yeah, it has really kind of an alchemical feel somehow, like some old alchemical books.
I love, that's the exact word we're going for. Bridging to some more traditional spiritual science knowledge. So it's built in a meta-modern sensibility. So meta-modern comes after postmodern. If you do meta down to post-modern, and then into traditional, alchemical is right in that sort of philosophy science in between space between traditional knowledge systems, spiritual, religious, into science. And so actually we're meta-modern, but going also back into traditional, even oral indigenous kinds of structures, and we're trying to bridge those sensibilities, or at least that's the gestalt we're after.
Right. I think probably meta is going to be a recurring word in the conversation we'll have today, because like I said just before the cameras were rolling, I found your work through Zach Stein, and who's been doing a lecture series on what he calls metapsychology on the Stoa, kind of diagnosing the fact that psychology as a field is horribly fragmented and sort of incoherent, and that we basically in this time of a meta crisis, which arguably we're in, where on all these different levels of analysis in our global civilization, we have these crises at military, political, economic, social, just you name it, and that arguably most of these crises at least have big roots in the human psyche, in how the human mind functions. And so if we don't have an adequate understanding of the human mind and its potentials, how can we possibly address these crises? So that's where you mentioned your work. So actually, I would love to get into what you think about his metapsychology and sort of contrasting it with yours. But maybe just to begin, I think it would be worth saying a word about the mental health crisis, sort of as an aspect of that meta crisis. The biggest database I was able to find recently was Gallup polls, doing like 5 million interviews with people representing something like 98% of the world's population, arguing that global unhappiness is on the rise, measured as how much anger, stress, sadness, physical pain, and worry people experience. It's not going in a good direction. So I'm curious to hear what your sense is of the situation there.
Yeah, no, I think it's very clear that our mental health is poor, low average to poor, and getting worse. And then especially when we contrast that in relationship to potential. Okay, so if you ask, one of the most simple things that people know in psychology is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? You may have heard of that. And it says basically if you get your basic physiological needs and your safety needs, then you get those taken care of. As long as those things are taken care of, then you get your belonging and esteem needs. They kind of need both. So given our technological power, at least in the current stage, now maybe ruin it because of environmental crises and stuff, but currently we have more technological economic power than ever before. So the baseline of our physical and biological needs should be taken care of. You would think then that would set us up for our belonging, esteem, actualization needs. So the common sense idea would be, when we get those things taken care of, then our mental health should be getting better. And it's absolutely not. Okay. Not getting better from a baseline, it is getting worse. Significantly worse, folks. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the worst group is our children. By far. Jonathan Haidt takes this very clear. He tells the story in 3 acts, which I think is pretty clear. We lose community, then we lose a play-based childhood, and then we give a phone-based childhood. So if you track anxiety and depression and suicidal behavior and all sorts of other indicators, not just self-report, but real behavioral indicators, the mental health of our children, that's really where I locate the mental health crisis. And where it's most obvious that we have in depression, anxiety, existential angst, a disconnect, confusion, inability to thrive across a third, maybe, of the population, struggling, and then the numbers of people that are really flourishing arguably are smaller, especially in the younger generation. It's tragic and brutal. So if you're talking well-being, what is well-being? Well, psychological well-being, we can talk about whatever that term means. We need a metapsychology to clarify it. But oh my gosh, depression, anxiety, lack of satisfaction, disconnection, loneliness, it's unbelievably important to the human condition. And we're seeing that our society's trajectory on it is disastrous. I call that the mental health crisis. It falls to me under with a larger meaning, part of the metacrisis I talk about in my book. It's tragic, and as somebody who has, of course, worked with people as a clinician, train people to work with them and know the suffering that the neurotic conditions, when I use that, that's depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, low life satisfaction, feeling demoralized and not knowing what to do and getting worse and worse, or getting more and more trapped by that outlook and experience. So amen to anybody out there suffering. Almost everybody will know somebody at least that's suffering, if not suffering themselves. I know how brutal it is. It's tragic. And man, I wish we could turn that around. So that's certainly part of the whole mission of UTOK, is to shine a light on that, to raise awareness of it, and be smart about how to transform it. I will say my discipline has not, this is the age of psychology and psychotherapy, and we're certainly not showing that we figured out at a societal level how to create a healthier society. In fact, we're participating in a society to watch the decline. And so folks that are psychologists, psychotherapists, as we've gotten more power, we have demonstrated a worsening of mental health. So societally, my system doesn't know what it's doing. I used to bitch about psychiatry and the way it would medicate neurotic problems with SSRIs and other things, but I look at my field down. I'm like, actually, I don't think we know what we're doing at a societal level in terms of helping this. In fact, I have lots of critiques about it. We can get into that. But anyway, it's tragic. We can do better. Lots of reasons why we're not doing very well at a societal level, and UTOK has a lot to say about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it is truly tragic. And recently I had the good fortune of having Stephen Hayes, founder of Act on.
Oh, really?
And it was fascinating to hear his take on this, because he definitely says, like, as a profession, psychotherapy and psychiatry has just not done its job. It was meant to alleviate all of this suffering. And if we just look at the numbers, it's just getting worse and worse, even though evidence-based psychotherapy is getting better and better, supposedly, in the science. But in terms of how we're helping people, the
Well,
global scale is just, yeah.
right. So, and I share a lot. In fact, the UTOK gives rise to what's called COMMO as one of its core components, and that's an integrative approach to psychological mindfulness. It overlaps directly with ACT, acceptance commitment therapy. That's what he found. So I have a huge amount of respect for him. However, as we just produced an article, my partner and I, Masia, just produced an article called The Common Core, okay, of psychotherapy. It delineates the unified approach and specifies what the Common Core is. In a way that actually raises questions about how we should be thinking about evidence-based practice. And I get into the details of this, but fundamentally we actually need we can't reduce these things to the alphabet soup of CBT, ACT, EFT, etc. And Steve is supporting of this with his process-based stuff. But the question is, how do we actually get process-based stuff into a society that doesn't cloister the language of mental health in a professional relationship and medicalize it or formalize it in a particular way that is actually alien, and that's actually what tends to happen. And then it's fragmented in that it doesn't embed itself. You know, you say, oh, we need a better account of the human mind. Actually, we don't know what that even means. It's like saying we need a better account of God. Well, do you even know what you're talking about when you use that reference? And and we're supposed to be scientists? And my whole point is actually, no, folks, that we psychologists don't know what you mean when you use the word human mind. We don't know, we don't have a framework for understanding that concept. Very different than chemists and atoms. Chemists know what atoms are, okay, folks? We psychologists don't know what the human mind is and don't have a framework for it. So we're out here telling you what things are and giving you little interventions for it, but we're fucking around with something we don't even understand ourselves. Good luck then trying to give that into a system that's already chaotic and adding little parts of knowledge to a system that's already broken. UTOK says, part of our problem is exactly that. We've fragmented and then we add fragmented bits, and while they have utility in their local space, there's a whole much bigger metacrisis, mental health crisis, metapsychology problem that actually not being addressed, and you're really vulnerable to adding chaos to the system if you don't have a big picture. I think that's what we've seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually very much the core of what I would love to talk to you about is, you know, how can we really scale everything we know about what actually works, what actually alleviates human suffering and promotes well-being? How can we get that to everyone in the culture, basically? I mean, it seems to me very clear as an outsider, how is it possible that a one-on-one psychotherapy model where someone has to go through more than a decade of professional training before they get this knowledge, and then it's only in that one-on-one relationship that it gets shared? How could that possibly reach everyone who's suffering? I don't see how it could possibly work. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
I mean, it can't. It doesn't. It can't. I mean, you can start. I'll grab this real fast. You can start with psychoanalysis. Okay, psychoanalysis, as it starts into the depths of it, and then generates a treatment model for five, folks. I don't know if you know Freudian original classic drive-based psychoanalysis. 5 years, 5 times a week. That's what 5 for 5 means. So that
Really?
a full course caseload of a psychoanalyst would be 5 patients. So that's the original. Okay, so the Steve Hayes of the world can tell the psychoanalyst, dude, you guys are not delivering, okay, at the level of scale that you're going to need to. You're going to create this problem, and then you're not going to. And so then we scale it back, but you still end up with the same effing problem, which is like, we're going to put this in the context of cloistered, one-on-one, trained interventions, as though the struggles of depression, anxiety, loneliness, low self-esteem, relational disconnect, and existential crises, as if that's a one-on-one problem. It's not a one-on-one problem. Look at the mental health crisis. It's a societal cultural problem as every bit as much as a psychological problem, and ultimately it's even a biological problem in the sense of how do we relate to nature. So there's a macroscopic scale here, that a narrow view that leads to a particular kind of intervention may be very, very problematic. In fact, if you look at what Jonathan Haidt's work suggests, first there's a breakdown in community, and then there's a breakdown of play-based childhood, part of which arises from what's called safetyism. Okay? Safetyism is the idea that, oh my God, we can see how emotional injuries are repressed in children, and we can see that it's a very dangerous world. So what we need to do is create the perfect environment to hold emotional injury, help people see the way they've been injured, and then mother them in a completely protective environment so that they're not actually injured by the unfair world that they live in. Oh my God, it turns out you try to do that at a societal level, and we see this with the extreme intense left, what I call woke 2.0, where we're going to try to protect everybody from any kind of injury and examine micro-injuries and microaggressions, of course. And while that's well-intentioned, when you actually multiply it, all you need to do is take a societal lens. Everybody now is a victim, and everybody needs a healer and a pillow space to manage their own, and everybody needs to be trauma-informed. Listen, folks, you're handing people microphones for their injury without recognizing what actually is. Look at all the wisdom traditions. What wisdom tradition orients us to focus on microaggressions and ruminate about the injury that they caused us over the years? I mean, Buddhism, is that what Buddhism fundamentally? You know a little bit about Buddhism, don't you?
Yeah.
It's like, does it tell you to say, oh my God, feel sorry for yourself and the way in which the world's injured you, and then advertise that to a professional and pay them so that they give you support? That's not exactly what Buddhism says about the self, is it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. In fact, Buddhism essentially says the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? I mean, in essence, it's like
don't
your little subjective
grievances,
right? Your subjective grievances are the road to resistance and pain. Okay, like that you cling to and try to create a grievance around. That's actually virtually all the wisdom traditions. Stoicism, all the wisdom traditions are actually be very careful. Now, listen. I'm a leftist at the level of, oh my God, there's a lot of injustices, there's a lot of racial injustices and gendered injustices, and that's systemic issues. But you focus at the individual level on what the systemic issues are, you've misguided the structure. At the individual level, you got to cultivate responsibility, robustness, resilienceness, don't bitch about shit. Systemically change structure. We have no conception about how to really, what's a societal level of analysis and the kinds of things we need to be doing versus a psychological level. Why? Because we don't even know what psychology is. So people are completely confused. Not surprisingly,
Absolutely.
people are completely confused about what it is. So UTOK fundamentally is a philosophy ultimately about living wisely, living adaptively, orienting toward wisdom. And it's certainly actually quite critical of exactly the point you make, because like the institutionalization of mental health is a very dangerous thing unless it's really clearly specified about what aspects. Certainly we want to institutionalize the management of things like schizophrenia, okay? But to institutionalize neuroticism and its treatment is a very, very dangerous thing. And that's what we've done. We've institutionalized neuroticism. We need a societal, sociocultural structure to understand what neuroticism is. And we need a societal structure to mitigate it that creates a culture, not just in the cloistered psychotherapy room, but in our classrooms, in our families, in our schools, in our communities. We need to understand what this is. We need to be clear about it, and everyone should have shared understanding. And actually, I think our mental health systems have given a flood of information, but actually very little coherent understanding, ultimately, to sort through what the hell we've learned. And it actually is quite a bit. And it's very helpful potentially, but we don't know how to give that in a way that would cause a society. I think UTOK can do this, but the field as a whole has failed to do this.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, I heard on a recent podcast you did that you actually gave up your clinical license. Is that right?
I did. I decided for pragmatic reason to get it back because I might need to do some things, but it was symbolic. I symbolically gave it up because I think we're completely misguided. I'll give you an example. Some people in my field will be like, oh, don't use the word neurotic because it's judgmental, people. Okay? Let's take a deep breath.
Big sigh.
Hug people that say that. Okay? Yeah, let's eliminate all of our language of any kind of valuation.
Very postmodern.
I mean, okay, how do you actually ground your assessment of what it is that I did? You just grounded your assessment of what I did was judgmental, right? So under what grounds are you operating from other than I'm going to obliterate the white male oppressive hegemony? Is that the only value that we can also assert? I mean, it's unbelievable when you actually deconstruct it. That's why I'm a metamodernist. It's a very important point, but it's a deconstructive point, not a constructive point.
Yeah.
So what is the constructive ground upon which we actually should be building our systems of justification? And here's one. If you feel sorry for yourself, you get injured by the world, okay? And then you feel like shit. And then you're exhausted and bitter about both yourself and the world. And all you think is, this world sucks. I suck. I can't believe I'm in this trouble. God damn it. How do I get out of this? Maybe I should kill myself. Okay? If you do that, folks, that's neurotic.
Yep.
And what do I mean by neurotic? Well, the Buddhists discovered this. Pain times resistance leads to suffering.
Yep.
And there you go. You get injured, and then your secondary reaction justifies it in a way that traps you, binds you to a narrow rule of blame, of avoidance, of misguided control. We call those the ABCs: avoidance, blame, misguided control. And if you grip the world that way, you're very vulnerable. So you're making it worse. It's like bringing water to a grease fire. Okay. So a neurotic loop is when you cope with the injuries of the world in a way that makes them worse. And then you feel worse. And then guess what? You continue to try to cope. So we should have the word neurotic. I mean, people do this.
Yeah.
Okay. It simply means coping with the world in a way that creates more problems. It's a maladaptive, understandable. We liken it to bringing water to a grease fire. Fire. Oh no, that sucks, right? Get water. Well, actually, if it's grease, you put water on, you're going to blow it up. Okay.
Yep.
If you blame yourself and blame the world in an ineffective way, if you avoid and try to defend and repress in an ineffective way, if you engage in misguided control, you make the situation worse.
Yeah.
Okay. Kids should learn that. Teachers should learn that. Families should learn that. Husbands and wives should learn that. And everyone should know what a neurotic loop is. Okay. And the idea that we police the term neurotic because it's judgmental, okay, is error one in safetyism. Okay.
Yeah.
Error one is just or an exemplar of how a safety mentality actually makes people more fragile, more defensive. It's misguided control. It blames me and creates an avoidance. Not the way we want to go. Okay.
Not very helpful.
So the point of it is that from a UTOK perspective, we need to know what neuroticism is. It's a different kind of psychopathology than psychotic struggles. The old folks got this, the old psychiatry. And then we need to know adaptively, at least, there are lots of things that contribute to neuroticism, but in a coping way, a neurotic loop is when a negative situation hits a negative feeling, creates a maladaptive, negative in that sense, reaction, and then that closes you down. Okay? Everyone should be educated about this. We know about these things. We know how thoughts do this. We know how feelings do this. We know how behaviors can contribute to this. The behaviors, the emotion-focused folks, the interpersonal theorists, the cognitivists, they all teach us actually about how neurotic, maladaptive patterns, that's where actually they get all their therapies from. They actually are engineering adaptive responses to maladaptive patterns. That's what all the therapies do. Just they focus on different systems. They focus on relationship systems, emotion systems, habits, thoughts. Okay. So we actually should be like, well, actually, why wouldn't we want adaptive behavior to cultivate well-being? Isn't that really like without schools of thought? Can we just have well-being as the goal, psychological well-being, fostering adaptive behavior? So that's what UTOK says. We should teach people about adaptive behavior. We should integrate the various insights into a coherent whole. We should recognize what's maladaptive, and then we should recognize the processes that reverse them. And that should be embedded in our societal structure first and foremost, not cloistered in a one-on-one psychotherapy system of change. So that's the overall argument that UTOK makes about this issue.
Right. And we should probably start getting into the unified theory of psychology and the unified approach to psychotherapy, which you've outlined some of the elements here. But before we do that, I'd just love to hear, like, how do we actually get it into the culture? I know this is a big issue, and it's not like we're going to find the answer quickly. But, for example, I recently did some volunteering for a nonprofit, Rethink Wellbeing. They're basically trying to expand therapy from just the professional relationship to, can we train facilitators by therapists so that they can teach groups some of the basic skills, like, for example, from the third wave cognitive behavioral therapies like ACT, there's a lot of generally applicable principles there that probably, if most people knew that, they would do better. And they just released their data, and you can see massive improvement even when it's facilitated by non-therapists. That's already a good direction, but I suspect you're going further in something like, can we integrate it into the education system? Can we, like, how?
So we'd have a couple of basic principles, okay? Know what neurotic loops are, everybody. It's negative situations hit negative feelings that create a reaction that's potentially negative, or it becomes a loop when those are maladaptive. That should be part of everybody's vocabulary, okay? And we're all vulnerable, especially if we've been bruised by life. So we actually bump this up, and bumps, the bump is when it happens. If you have a vulnerability, we call that a bruise. So you got a bump, a bruise, and then you loop. Like, everyone can learn that, but we don't teach that, right? So then the question is, what do you do with bumps and bruises? This is what's called a COM-MO flashlight, okay? That's what I reached up and grabbed. You can see on it, it's got CalmMO.
Very cool.
Okay?
Yeah.
And the argument is just hand CalmMO flashlights out to schools and families and everything. And then get people curious about what that means. By the way, that's the C in this. I'm like, what the heck is this? It's like, shine a CalmMO flashlight on your neurotic loops.
Yeah, which it stands for CalmMO, just the acronym?
Exactly. No, I will, yeah. So, but the first thing I wanted to show is like, hey, get people curious about this thing. What the heck is it? And get people recognizing that we have discovered a simple pattern that fits in folk psychology. Like everyone can see, hey, bad shit happens. I mean, what does a parent do, right? Good parent, actually. Okay, you got a kid. Mike, I got 3 kids. Kids, you get injured. Why were you injured? Why do you feel shame? As you probably should feel shame. Don't be afraid of shame. Shame, oh, you did something fucked up. You screwed it up. Yeah, no wonder you feel lousy. Makes perfect sense. Now, learn from that and grow from that. That's basically, that's what good parents do. Not like, oh my God, I can't believe the world was so bad that you I'm sure didn't do anything. You're a wonderful kid. You know, or the old dismissive parents. Of course, we got the therapists after they used to be pretty cold and dismissive. So it's that sweet spot between being supportive and encouraging and holding people accountable. So anyway, what is CalmMO? MO stands for a metacognitive observer, mindful. Okay, instead of reactivity, instead of neurotic reactivity, which is where people can get in, you get mindfully responsive and reflective. MO is a shift outside your normal resistance, to use a better, into a mindful awareness of what is happening that you can then observe. So the meta observer shifts, and we call that ultimately, when you develop, it's called sage mode, which means you can occupy the perspective of a wise other on your situation. Okay?
Interesting.
Right? So I have inside of me, as soon as I get bumped by the bruises that I carry, I instantaneously can now occupy my sage mode meta observer. It says, and I'll do things like Greg was just injured. Notice I shift. When you say your name, it gives you a little third person perspective. Greg was just injured. He's pissed off because he's got this neurotic vulnerability from his relationship with his dad or whatever. And this reminded of him. And so he's overreacting, and that's going to get him to blame the other because he projects off his own vulnerabilities onto the situation. Be nice if we all could do that, right? It's like, oh, let me tell you what I'm doing. And let me do it with, then what is the attitude of the sage? Okay. The attitude of the sage is calm, which, by the way, is the opposite of neurotic. That means you're content and stable as opposed to negative and reactive. And then it's an acronym that says get curious. C is curiosity. Open yourself up to gain insight about what's going on. If you can't say what I just said about me, try to figure out, hey, what's going on with me? Was I just injured by a bruise here? And do I know what that is? That's curiosity. Okay. So it's an issue of being, instead of being closed and critical, you're actually curious, open, and wondering about the injury. Oh, isn't this interesting that I was injured? Okay. Not like, how would I be injured? And this better not happen again. Or I better not, I'm not doing anything wrong. So, maybe I am. A comes right from ACT, acceptance, and Buddhism. Okay. Which, by the way, is really hard. Okay. If you think that acceptance is easy, you're not looking at the hard stuff. It is hard. Okay. Because a lot of times you are a weak loser who's going to die.
Yeah, that happens.
Okay? That happens, right? And the issue is like, at least in a way, now that doesn't mean you're not lovable, and it doesn't, they're how to frame this, but it is the case that people lose, people break, the world hits them, shit happens, you get injured, and your body, the negative affect system says, this sucks, and you know what? It's right. Okay? And that whole system has to be like, I understand where that's coming from, I know what that means, and I know its depth. And obviously, if you've lost a child, okay, there's that, you know, how do we accept those kinds of things? But a lot of people have bruises that and that's a great question. And I thankfully have never had to confront that. I don't know if I could accept that. But we should know what we couldn't accept, right? And what we can accept is, Greg, you can be a little defensive about this because you have a history. I can accept that, right?
Yeah.
And I can accept that I screwed up, and I can accept that so acceptance is key. And of course, that's from ACT. L stands for loving compassion. Meta with 2 T's, okay? The capacity to love self, love the world, love other with richness, depth, fundamental respect, and have compassion, whereby you are oriented toward the reduction of suffering. And then finally, M is motivated toward valued states of being, okay? Rather than trying to control, you're committed to use, and actually the A and the M are exactly aligned with acceptance and commitment. Okay.
Yeah.
It also bridges to other things like Dan Siegel's got an interpersonal neurobiology approach, which has more loving and relationality. Problem with ACT and all the CBTs is not good on relationality.
Yeah.
Okay?
That's what I thought.
They're reduced to the self, and then, and everything's inside the psychological structure. I got to accept, I got to commit. It's like, what about the loving relational world? Yeah, that's important too. But actually, then they punt over to interpersonal theorists and psychodynamic.
Yeah. Because that's their field,
attachment.
right?
That's their
That's
field.
what they're good at.
We don't, right. We don't really do attachment, and we only do emotion like regulation stuff. We're really getting in touch with your emotions. That's the humanistic EFT, emotion focused people. It's like, well, actually, we're all psychologists. I think emotions are important. I think habits are important. I think relationships are important. I think thinking's important. I think mindfulness is important. It's like, I don't want to choose. Like, am I going relationships or am I going individual? It's like,
all of the above, please.
Hey, why do we do yin yang? Like, you guys heard of dialectical holes, or whatever. So anyway, loving compassion into then motivated valued states of being. It's an interpersonal, holistic view that is very ACT friendly, and all it said, the core then is a kid should be. What's a neurotic loop in culture? Why do you split off? Okay, you're a primate and a person. How do you regulate that relation? Watch the looping. When you find a loop in yourself or a friend, turn on the ComMemo flashlight. Get ComMemo flashlights in the hands of educators, parents, friends, lovers, etc. That's the issue. And then everyone can be like, shine ComMemo lights on neurotic loops. That's what to me, and this is what the Common Core says, that's actually what we've discovered what works. The Common Core teaches us very clearly, meaning when we look at what really works in psychotherapy, evidence-based practice is a dangerous concept, quite frankly. I can get into why. It's a dangerous concept.
I would love
and it
to
has
hear it,
anchors in what's called ESTs, empirically supported treatments. Okay, you have to understand the history. It's an understandable thing, but it's got a huge critique against it. And I can articulate that. We certainly want evidence, and we certainly want our arguments based in evidence, but we need to know what the evidence actually says. And I can be clear about that. The evidence says that there are neurotic loops, and if we effectively shine ComMemo flashlights on them at the process level, things get better. That's what we know. Now, how to implement that, how we do that, etc. There's issues, but we actually know that. I think there's an unbelievable set of arguments. It's what's called common factors. You need to know what common factors are. There's a thing called common factors. We evolve the common factors to the Common Core, and then say these are the principles, and they're not. You don't need a PhD to learn them. Yeah.
That's the thing. It's not that complicated.
It's not that complicated. It's like, if you got injured and then are acting like an asshole, slow down. Get a friend, talk it out, get curious, accepting, loving, compassionate, and try to be better. Hey.
Who would have thunk it?
It's like, check with your wise grandmother, see if you can translate it into wise grandmother language, and be like, oh, that's actually probably good at the societal level. And the argument is the evidence is very strong. That's what really works. Yeah. Okay? That's what really works. And then we dress it up. That's why ESTs, they dress it up into specific technical PhD language and then package it into treatments that then are insurance-based and then say, well, I worked with Beck for 4 years. Cognitive psychotherapy was the first EST, was really the first popular EST. Okay? Empirical support treatment is cognitive psychotherapy. Okay. And Beck thought that the key was to get in there, get those thoughts that are causing problems and adjust them with dysfunctional thought records. And he had empirical evidence that supported that and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it's partially true, but actually there's a broader issue you're missing because you try to jam everything into your brand. That's what the ESTs do, is they jam everything into a fucking brand. We don't want to brand your adaptive living. You don't want to brand that across society. Imagine, everything reduces to cognitive therapy? No. Okay? No.
Amazing.
We don't want that. Okay? Yeah. Because it's a brand. But everything reduces to, excessively reacting in a problematic way that results in suffering. Let's check with Buddhism. Yeah, that's pretty good. It was 2,500 years ago. That's okay. That's going to cut across societies. It's going to cross history. There's a lot of wisdom there. How we put it in our modern language. How do we get that out into society without any branding? That's some of what UTOK would be about. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I didn't know about this backstory of evidence-based care. I know that the whole evidence-based care movement is sort of started in the 90s, also in medicine, where you have this gold standard of RCTs. And for some people, that's like, if it's not an RCT, it's not evidence. And it's like, wait a minute, we've had evidence criteria for a very long time that were very different. And that doesn't mean it's not true or it's not real or.
Right. So a real quick snapshot, because this is unbelievably important. It is so there's the golden age of psych, and really RCTs certainly are start in medicine, but they get solidified as ESTs in psychology. And then actually medicine comes back and takes that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, they have the design. Why? Because if you have a pill, a placebo, and a double-blind randomized controlled clinical trial is a great way to go. I used a lot of technical jargon there. I'll say that real fast. So I ran for Beck a randomized controlled clinical trial. What does that mean? It means randomization means people come in, they have inclusion criteria to get into the study. Okay. Then you get randomized to some condition. Okay. Classically you have a placebo condition or a control condition, and then you have the intervention condition. Okay, if you randomize them, you control for all the other variables, presumably, drop them in the condition, run, and then see what happens. And because of that control, you can say, well, this course of history took this way, this course controlling for everything else, therefore the intervention caused the difference. That's what makes it powerful. Okay? Well, actually, how do we know, though, because all of bias, how do you know that the intervention wasn't something that people wished for at first and then biased all of their ratings? And actually you don't. So medicine built the double-blind randomized controlled trial trial where they produced two pills of the exactly same look, and they sealed everything, and the doctors and the patients had no idea whether or not the pill they were taking had the active ingredients or a sugar pill. Okay?
Right.
You know, and that's the beauty. That's like everybody's blind. That's double blind. Like the patient doesn't know, the doctor doesn't know. The only person that knows is inside the design, and therefore it's a powerful effect. It's the active ingredient inside of this thing. Okay, then that's great. It's a wonderful thing. However, and it gives you this ability to control and use the methods to science to infer, and ultimately, arguably, deduce. Although that's a much more complicated. It's an induction, abduction, deduction argument. But anyway, that's technical stuff. And then you're like, let's try to do that with psychotherapy. Okay. That's what they tried. Now, a double-blind psychotherapy intervention
is that possible?
Okay. Yeah. So how am I not going to know that I'm the active agent?
Yeah.
So you can't really, so we have to, it's not double-blind, but we can run controls. Okay. And that's what and the timing here was the golden age, I started to say, the golden age of the 70s, we're having the emergence of humanism, of psychodynamic behavioral approaches. They're showing some utility, but nobody knows how to regulate them except the practitioners themselves. So you have a psychoanalyst who's like, well, this person needs 3 times a week therapy for 5 years. And back in the day, the script would just be written for that. Okay. And so you would have like, wait a minute. As insurance comes along and starts managing this, they're like, what am I paying for? That's what happened. Okay. What are we paying for? That's what happened. And then the issue was, well, if we're going to pay insurance-wise for a medical intervention, it needs evidence that it actually works. So it was the demand from insurance was one of the huge things. Another thing that was happening was that psychotherapists they videoed their actual sessions, and then you actually started to see, well, wait a minute, you guys actually just talk about problems, really. Right? You guys sit down, you have a conversation. Now there's a lot of technical jargon, but you apply your technical jargon, make it sound a lot different, but actually you asked him about his mother, and you asked him about his mother, and then you exhibited empathy, and then you tried to help instill hope, and actually you guys all did that. You just use, and then you come back and explain it. And when we read the studies of what you did through your technical language, it sounded like you did all this different stuff. But it's not like the behaviors didn't talk. Okay.
Yeah.
Or the psychoanalyst didn't show any emotion. Right. Okay. So they all did all these different things. And then you had this horse race mentality, the race for the first issue is empirically supported treatments. These are things that match the intervention with the disorder, that show that the intervention has effectiveness at treating the disorder. Okay. And it turns out that this model sucks. It's a disastrous model. It doesn't work. It's called the Great Psychotherapy Debate. Okay, Bruce Wampold. And actually, the Common Core pulls this off of this argument. great psychotherapy debate. What is actually happening evidence-wise that results in good outcome? Two basic models, one coming from medicine and the other's coming from psychosocial process, okay? So these are the two, this is the great psychotherapy debate. One explanation, we have discovered technologies, refined technologies that allow us to diagnose specific kinds of problems, okay? Create interventions that fix certain kinds of problems, and those interventions are the responsible for the good outcome. Okay. I'll give you a great example. I had a cyst in my back. I had a lot of pain for about 4 months. Just a lot of fucking pain. Couldn't get a good diagnosis. Finally got an MRI. Put up an MRI and say, Greg, see that big circle right there inside your spine? That's like the size of a grape. And we're pretty sure that's pressing on your sciatic nerve. We need a surgery to go in there and cut it out, and hopefully everything will be fine. And everything it was. Okay. That's a great example of a specific diagnosis. Of a particular
very specific,
problem,
yeah.
That it was a specific intervention that talk therapy would not have helped with other than help me cope, okay?
Yeah.
But they took that thing out of there, and thank God for the medical engineering group. Do you know what I do not do when I do therapy? I don't peer inside somebody's head, pop out the equivalent of their cyst, remove it from them without their knowledge, and then, or without their, other than saying thank you, and then put them on their way. I never have done that.
Yeah.
Okay? So psychotherapy makes this argument that we're diagnosing and creating interventions as if it's like medicine. And then the psychosocial argument is actually you're relating to people in healthy and adaptive ways, and you're helping them transform their psychosocial process. And you do it because you're a legitimized healer. You form a good relationship with them. You help them see you're good at helping them gain insight and hope relative to their problems. So there's this cognitive conceptualization issue. And then you motivate them to try new shit. And when they try good shit, you reward them and encourage them to do more. And when it doesn't work, you inspire them to try something else and keep working until you get a good outcome. Okay? If you have a good relation, if you're a legitimized healer that has a good relation, that helps the person understand, where you can say we have a shared conceptualization that we both believe in and can gain hope around, and then you act in a particular way to test to see whether it helps you to explore new terrain, support the ones that do, change the ones that don't, and continue on that. Those folks, that's what's called common factors. And those are the ingredients, actually, that we can demonstrate over and over again are associated with good outcome. It's almost by definition when you look at it, okay? But it doesn't make any freaking difference whether you're a family therapist, an interpersonal therapist, an emotion-focused therapist, cognitive therapist, psychodynamic, on and on. What language you use? The question is, if you hit these ingredients, that's what's associated with outcome.
Wow.
Okay, so the refined knowledge of the diagnosis, the refined knowledge, the doctoral level training, it matters only because it gets you more skill at helping people see, but it doesn't matter because you're identifying the family system as opposed to your traumatic history that you're defending against, as opposed to the habits that you engage in, as opposed to the beliefs that you have, as opposed to the current relationships. Those are all different. And you can look at all of them, and it's just the skill. So unlike the fact that I had a cyst in my back that was very clearly diagnosed and very clearly excised for a benefit, psychotherapy doesn't work that way. First and foremost, it works as a psychosocial process that bring people into a healing ritual, give them credibility, make them believe that they can change, identify in a believable way that you share, ways in which they can do, test it, and see how they work. That's what psychotherapy is, folks. Okay?
That's so interesting.
So you're like, why don't you get that? Okay, and anybody that's going to come along and say, we discovered this, they're horse racing. They're branding and they're horse racing. Okay? Because the first thing that you need to ask is, well, do you do better than the common core? Okay? Do you find me somebody who's really skilled at relating to people with this problem, giving an understanding of this problem from another way, motivating them to change, and I'll horse race you, whatever your little intervention is. And the argument is that you need to be the credible common core approach. In fact, that's what we argued, is actually psychotherapy may grow once it identifies the common core. Okay. Now, with the common core, there may be specific things you do for OCD or anorexia or ADHD. But right now, the main thing that we have is the common core that's clouding everything. What we argue is we can delineate the common core through UTOK. Once we delineate the common core, and we brand it here with a COMMO flashpipe, but you can brand it with ACT, you brand it with all the context process stuff, whatever you want. Okay? But you contextualize the process. That's what the common core shows. You show your skill to contextualize the process, and then that's where most of the healing, reliable healing, that's what actually is evidence-based practice that we argue. That's
Mm.
evidence-based practice. And that's the evidence that we actually know. Now, if you want real evidence-based, once we have this, okay, then here's an analogy we use. Like back in the day, they did surgery, okay, without any concern about the context, like their hands and whether they were covered in bacteria. And surgery had all sorts of crappy outcomes.
Yeah,
okay?
no shit.
Right? Surprisingly enough, if you're birthing one mother to another mother to another mother using your same hands, it turns out that the germ theory gives us a good explanation why that's a nightmare. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so the contextual process of surgery was we got to have a sterilized environment that appreciates the patient, takes care of them, and gives rise to a context process. You take care of that, then we might be able to find. So the same thing for psychotherapy is that we need the contextual process model to understand the general healing factors that go along with transforming maladaptive patterns into adaptive ones. Once we have that, then it is plausible to me that we can then get more specific about particular interventions. But we have conflated the surgery interventions with the context of surgery. And mostly what we found is overall, there's the context stuff that we can delineate. Unfortunately, because it's common factors, we don't have a theory of it. So it's just common sense, like what to ask your grandmother, you know? It's like, but actually UTOK then put your grandmother's theory and real meta theory, metapsychology, and that's a very different game. Now we actually have a meta theory, metapsychology of your grandmother that actually refines us into the cosmic evolution all the way down to quantum mechanics, general relativity, chemistry, and everything else. Now we actually have a network of science down into physics to your grandmother. That's good. That's useful. That's UTOK.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah. It's so interesting. When I had Stephen Hayes on, he kind of very much made a very similar argument to yourself right now, as in, especially when you test a protocol, let's say for CBT, you don't really, if the protocol supposedly works, it gives you good outcomes. It doesn't necessarily tell you why the protocol works. It doesn't tell you what process was responsible for the change. And so he actually told me about this massive study he did with a team of colleagues. I think it took them 3 years to do it. It was a massive literature review. I think it was the study was called something like idionomic approach. Maybe you're familiar with it. It was just this mass 50,000 studies I think they looked at to see, did mediational analysis to see within RCTs, can you identify the processes that were responsible? And there he actually comes to the conclusion that therapeutic alliance is responsible for only very little. I mean, you can contest that probably, but and he argues that the core processes that really, really drive the change are things like psychological flexibility, which is, of course, what ACT is for. I'm very curious if you have thoughts on this kind of approach, so, mediation analysis.
Right. Let me be clear about right. There's a dismantling. You can do that statistically. You can do that methodologically. Okay. Therapeutic alliance refers to many different things. Okay. There's the narrow definition, which is the relationship liking piece. Okay. So relationship, do you like your therapist? That's one piece of it. Okay. Now, whether or not you like your therapist is, if you isolate that away from everything else, then yes, that does not contribute a lot. Okay. So then you get into, well, what does? Well, then psychological flexibility. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, we mean the capacity to think differently about your situation, to be open to adaptive change and feedback. In other words, for him, he's separating. So for us, in the original Borden analysis of therapeutic alliance is three things, not one thing. Okay, this is where you get an academic refinement. You got to go. So one element is quality of the relationship, whether the person likes you, sees you as competent and a legitimate healer. That's one. Second is, do they help you develop a shared understanding of what is going on? That's where then I would basically say, does the therapeutic relationship afford psychological flexibility in the reconstitution of what the problem is? Okay. All right. So, and not put it differently, remember what I said about neurotic loops? Okay. If you're reciprocally narrow and say, I know my father did this and he abused the fuck out of me, blah, 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 and that's what all that matters. And my life is completely ruined. Okay. In relationship to the injury that my father bestowed upon me, and the rest of my history is now fixed. Notice how narrow that is and fixed. My friend John Vericke would say that's a reciprocal narrowing. Right?
Don't do that.
Well, that's right. Okay. So my job, how do I help create a context in which that frame is loosened and transformed into a reciprocally open frame? I give hey man, I totally get this is an injury. This is an injury that's defined you. Do you like that it defines you? What do you mean? I mean, is this, you want this to define you?
Mm.
Well, I mean, it does define you. You mean you would want it to not define you? Huh, that's really interesting. There's a part of you that doesn't want to be defined by this, huh?
Mm.
Okay. Notice, wait, now all of a sudden just my questions, okay? So to me, certainly the environment requires psychological flexibility. And those are actually the other two elements of the board and alliance, is that you foster shared understanding that creates hope, that creates actions, ritual actions, that invest in change, that then feed back. The outcome informed care, by the way, is then this idea you feed back whether or not you like the therapist on one hand, and whether or not the symptom reduction / well-being improvement is what you expect. Okay, so that's, you feed back that in, and then you can test whether or not the psychological, whether or not you're engaged in broadening adaptive flexibility, which, by the way, is curiosity, acceptance, love and compassion in general, motivated toward valued states of being. That's flexible relative to the reciprocal narrowing. Okay, so I agree with him certainly that really, but to me, what I would say, Steve, okay, you're acting still. Okay, you're acting, and what I mean by that is you're branding that thing. Okay, and you are framing your brand in a way. Okay, you have your brand, Steve. I got UTOK. I'll own my brand. Well, my brand's a little bigger than your brand, but anyway, there we go. We have brand egos, right? There we go. It's brand egos. But anyway, that's the issue is what level of branding do we want to engage in? So that is how I see that basic analysis.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, I one of the things you just mentioned with the call memo, if I'm not mistaken, you would apply that sort of curious, accepting, loving, compassionate, and so on attitude to at least 5 different levels of analysis within your being, if I'm not mistaken, right? So this is your CAST system, the what does it stand for? Character Adaptation Systems Theory. We have sort of a habit layer, experiential. Let me see if I can remember it. Relational, defensive, and justification. Is that right?
That's beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. So you get practice at seeing yourself. So you have a meta observer, then how do you understand yourself? Okay. The first thing we do is we actually teach the justifying layer. That's the talking ego layer on the feeling layer. Okay. So if you want to understand yourself further, then you create the CAS layer, which actually you have these different recursive layers, okay, of being in the world. You have a procedural habit layer. That's your automatic tendency. Situation pops something, you get a craving, you want to rear it in a procedural loop. Okay. That also is what you want to check in the habit layer, is you want to check your lifestyles, okay, and your circadian rhythm around things like sleep, eating, exercise. Okay. Yep. So the base habit layer shines the light on lifestyles, shines the light on stimulus response, the behavioral history, the history of behaviorism and behavioral interventions. Shine a light on the habit structure. That's essentially what they're basically all about. Okay, the behavioral habit. I don't need to worry about mine, just what's the sensory motor looping structure in the environmental context and shift that. Okay. One up from that is your embodied experience of being, which is your emotional system, energized motion. That's actually really what E is, sitting and evaluating what is expected relative to what's coming in. Okay. And then it marks particular modes that says this is, especially if we're talking negative, this is bad. Okay, it's not what we expected, not what we like. All right, that's what and then it has different flavors to that. It has shame and guilt on the one hand, where you defer yourself, look to the other, oh God, or anger, rage, which is like, I can't believe it. Okay, and then general anxiety about the end's future, sadness about the pressure, and then a felt sense of negativity. Okay, that's not going the way you want. All right. So we want to get in touch with that. Okay, the core emotions, and this is what emotion-focused therapy is. All right. You want to create a space where you're aware and attuned. We call this emotional sweet spot on the one hand, and adaptively regulating, because by the way, this is more a primate system, indeed a mammal system, okay, than it is a person system. So if you just let yourself go with emotion, you punch somebody in the face when they cut in front of you in line, then all of a sudden you may be going to jail. Like, that's not good. You can't behave like a person if you're on your emotional impulses. Okay. So you have to regulate those things adaptively across time. Then you sit in a relational world where you're managing social influence and relational value. That's a relationship. You have your own attachment history, which brings you all the schema, the psychodynamic. People shine a light on that. You have your self-conscious justifying system, which is in the context of justification. You get your automatic thoughts that would shine the light on, and then that's your core beliefs. You also have a worldview. And then in between all of that, you have this weird defensive structure, which is called the Freudian filter, and all the psychodynamic processes. If you get good at shining the light, you will be able to see yourself as a nested system of habits, emotional feelings, relational schema as a primate, a defensive structure trying to regulate that shit, and a person, private justifier that justifies to yourself, and a public justifier through a persona that justifies to other people. You shine the light on those things, and then you ask, how are they operating? What are my valued states of being? And am I optimizing my outcome relative to my valued states of being, or am I acting like a jerk? Which is fine, because trust us, we all operate as jerks some of the time. That's what a defensive human being is. It's vulnerable, it's reactive, and then it's going to retaliate either to the self, like crush the self because I'm a loser, or attack back, or give up out of frustration, etc. Which is all, I say that totally lovingly. Like, that's okay. That's what we do. That's what kids do. I don't know. I have 3 kids. I saw them, when they're 3, they act like jerks, it's okay. We love them, that's fine. So.
Totally. No, I love that. And actually, as we're talking about this, I thought it might be fun just to do a little hypothetical case study. Like, let's say that, and apply the calm MO to that. Would that be okay?
Yeah. Totally.
Like let's say I'm a person who struggles with quite a bit of social and general anxiety. And it's bleeding into my sleep. I'm having trouble sleeping as well because of it. I'm a bit isolated. Good. And I'm also kind of experiencing some depression because I find it hard to, find my sense of purpose, clear sense of purpose in life. I just can't orient to that clearly, and find it difficult to regulate my attention as a result. So let's say I come to you with this, like, how would you apply the calm MO approach to this, let's say?
Totally. So let's think about this in 2 different ways. There's states context and general understanding context. Okay. So general understanding context is we want to cultivate your identity overall. Okay. And get in right relationship to this. Okay. So let's think about wrong one. No, I don't have any problems. It's no big deal. Whatever. I don't know what this is. I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Let's start there. Okay. So notice how what you're able to do when you've started at least a narrative that describes certain things that allow you to have some contact with it. Okay. So I want to enrich the narrative in general of your identity. I have social anxiety.
Right.
Okay. So there are specific, if you said, well, yesterday I had social anxiety and you wanted to deal with that, I would then say, hey, what triggered it? We could then go into the specifics, see what the neurotic loop was, and break each one of those points down. Okay. Right. So as soon as you got triggered, did you shift and say, oh, I am Timo, I've been triggered? Did you say that? Or did you say, fuck, I hate this. This is happening again. Okay.
Right.
So if you said second, if you then said, I hate this and this is happening again, this sucks, and then narrated sort of a catastrophe line, you then engage in a neurotic loop. Right. Versus calm MO. As you say, oh, here's this thing again. Okay.
I've been down this lane. Yeah.
I know what this is. And that's why I would want to build the identity narrative first. Okay. And I would actually have folks, I wrote a blog because I had a number of people with social anxiety. By the way, it's an underdiagnosed entity and people do not know how to treat social anxiety. Absolutely. It's an important feature. Okay. And it's important to distinguish between what's called avoidant tendencies, that's your narrative structure, and social phobic tendencies. They get blurred. And anyway, I could then give what I would want to do is I want to help you see, okay, what this is. Okay. What I wouldn't want to do is, oh, you have this disorder, put you on a pill, then don't worry about it. Trust me, it has nothing to do with you and it's not your fault. Okay.
That's not helpful.
Okay. Yeah. There are elements that we want to say, if you're blaming yourself, what the hell's wrong with me? Then I want to say there's a thing called neuroticism. Okay. It's called trait neuroticism. Trait neuroticism is your tendency in the habit and experiential system to experience negative affect. Okay. Your general tendency is high. And because you're low extroverted, that means you don't seek, you introvert yourself and then become hypersensitive to any potential threat which you project onto the world, and then walk around with an alarm system that's constantly saying, this is going to be a nightmare, this is going to be a nightmare, this is going to be a nightmare. This isn't what you intended, this isn't what you wanted to do, but this is how your primate system is now built, okay? And we need to teach you how to ride this horse, because you have a social anxiety neurotic horse. And if you don't know how to ride this thing, it's going to drive you right into the stable and sit you down into a miserable, depressive shutdown. And it sounds like that's even starting to happen. Okay? And so that's what I want to help you understand. And I want to help you ride the horse better. Okay? And we'll see what we can get to. But I can already tell you, do a number of things that drive the horse into the stable. Makes perfect sense. So the more we drive it in this table, the more the more time you're there, the more discouraged you'll get, the more depressed you're going to get. So we don't want to do that. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the first thing we want to do is we want to love you. Okay. We want to love you, and I understand it. How a lot of people deal with this. It sucks. We want to acknowledge there's a part of you that's really frustrated with this. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to hold that. But to the extent that we just act, oh my God, this sucks, or we try to deny it, we try to blame yourself for it, we try to control the world so that it doesn't happen, that's probably not the way to go. Okay. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to understand how to accept what you're feeling. Okay. We're going to have loving compassion. We're going to open up different ways of being and see what gives your sense a sense of mastery and approach, because those are the opposite actually of threat and avoidance, mastery and approach. And we will explore your environment and test it. Little experiment. This is what Beck was good at, collaborative empiricism. We test various elements. When you get a little mastery and you feel like you can do it, man, we're going to, and I believe you can. I've already sensed that you have these potentials. You notice I'm dropping. Okay. You'll bring that stuff and we will grow that. And it's through those potentials that you can greatly reduce the way this is hurting you and also come to live with this as a part of who you are. Yeah, I got a little social anxiety. It's part of my structure. It's okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's actually a kind of a real case in a sense. I used to have it many years ago, and a huge part of what helped was just accepting that I got anxious sometimes because I was trying to avoid anxiety. I got afraid of being anxious, and you get into that loop, and before you know it, you don't want to go out because, I might get this again. And just actually it was encouraging the anxiety to increase even more was the thing that seemed to have solved it. Just okay,
so there's totally. So this is a beautiful. So there's fear and fear of fear.
Yeah.
Okay. And fear of fear is the opposite, right? So that's why you're in Buddhism, right? You're like, actually, fear of fear is a second order problem, right? Yeah. That's avoidance. That's exactly neurotic loop. You get fear of fear. Now you're going to be trying to hide and engage in misguided control. And if you get discouraged, you blame yourself. Get discouraged with the world, you blame the world. There you go. Yeah. And it's like, hey, let's shine the light on that, dude, and it's okay, you just have to, and this is one of the things you have to accept. People are narcissistic fantasies that we'll be perfect and we don't have any scars, we don't have any bumps, we'll be brilliant, genius, beautiful people that always are successful. Well, good luck, good luck with that. Okay. And then when you're like, okay, you're a talking ape. That's what UTOK tells us, And at one level, you're a freaking miracle. Maybe God-given, I don't know, but whatever. But at the very least, at a complexification, you're a God-given miracle. Your experience is a miracle. We should honor that. You're a sacred entity, even if you're fucked up and neurotic in some ways, like we all are. It's okay. Right. Yeah. So it is that mindset of being like, hey, I'm going to challenge you to do better as I love you. I mean, that's the dialectic, and crucial dialectic. And yeah, I think when you talk to people who get out of this kind of stuff, and this is over and over, these are the processes and the transformational kind of themes that you hear over and over.
Yeah, totally. So is it true that at the moment you're actually teaching things like Calm MO through courses? I saw you had a course on, what is it called? Parallax? A UTOK course?
Well, actually, no one signed up for that, so we actually didn't make it there. I would.
Really?
We tried to. That was framed as kind of getting used to into UTOK. I'm not sure if we framed it all that well, but certainly we offered courses on UTOK, like especially with my partner Masi and I, and obviously as a professor in directing this thing. In the program, Calm MO is a very common framework of reference. So absolutely yes, but actually we're looking to figure out more sophisticated ways of marketing this and getting this out there. And we do want to, we're actually next year, we're really going to be looking to build a significant Calm MO course to figure out a way to get these flashlights into people's hands and understand what neurotic loops are. We blogged a lot about it with very popular blogs on Psychology Today. We've actually been approached to write a book on it, my partner and I. That wasn't the right time because I was in this book. But next year, we're looking to do courses and books on these kinds of things because we think, this is the kind of message we believe that both hits you right at the individual level, at the small relational level, like between people, dyads and triads and things like that, and societally. Okay. Yeah. This is that like society can digest this and move in the right direction. It doesn't carry. It's systemically reflective and conservative, actually. It doesn't say, it just says, okay, this is actually common sense across the wisdom traditions. It's just updated in our modern knowledge and modern knowledge of human psychology. But it actually, anything that would go against the wisdom traditions is something I'm very suspicious of. And I think we want to look to that to say, these are the directions that we want to head in.
Right. Yeah. So actually, this is one of the questions that I had when I read about your unified theory. I immediately thought of a book like Integral Psychology by Wilber. Like this is another very sort of early attempt in the 90s to create this sort of very unifying, overarching theory of psychology where you're doing this meta-modern thing, integrating some of the wisdom science understanding about states of consciousness and maybe even awakening, things like that.
Totally.
I'd be very curious if you have thoughts on that kind of project and maybe also Zach's metapsychology. How does it relate to your model?
Right. So I'll start with Wilber. So Wilber, where I end up is very similar to where Wilber ends up, although we come from totally different, very different frames. In other words, Wilber is a pretty independent scholar, zooms out and then realizes the East have framed certain stuff in a way that isn't contradictory to science, but gives us a big picture. And then he gives us a science spirituality integral view, which then pops with all-qual. At least if I'm going to do basic Wilber, all-qual is where I want to go. And the lines of development across, say, consciousness give Wilber a developmental ontology. That's really interesting and valuable. And then you have the quadrants, which for me really are epistemology. Okay, so the way we frame interior individual, interior collective, exterior individual, exterior collective. Wilber has tremendous insight in relationship to this, and this is a very powerful heuristic. I'll say that when I produced my work in 2003, my first insight's 1996, so just in terms of my development, I go in and become a psychotherapist. I think I'm going to be CBT EST guy. Real science, okay?
Evidence-based.
Real science is what I want to, all folk psychology. I want to nail this down. I want to see what the data are. I want to make an evidence-based deduction rather than bullshit human, folk psychology, okay? That's where I get trained as. So I'm a natural behavioral science by inclination. Then I actually learn, that's where I'm headed, and then I learn what's called the psychotherapy integration perspective, which is actually this common factors thing is more evidence-based, far more evidence-based than these EST specifics. And I become 100% convinced that the great psychotherapy debate, as Bruce Wallenpaup framed it, is way more powerful than the specific interventions. I then also see that actually, psychotherapy shouldn't be based on schools of thought and brands. It should actually be based on human psychology. Right? Like the science of human psychology should inform us. So this is where, and it turns out this is where my great experience in the world as an academic is. I have a rediscovery, which I sort of know, and no one knows what the F psychology is. That's my claim. Nobody knows what that concept is. It's this unbelievably vague, amorphous thing, and there's something very specific that we can say about it that's, I believe, tremendously fascinating. And that is, it sits at a nexus between the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. And no one can say what it is. And more than that, when we talk about the hard sciences, the reason that the best way to define them hard is actually they have a coherent, relatively coherent, consensually agreed upon ontological referent. That's a technical term by saying they know what the F they're talking about. Like biology,
the thing that actually exists that they're referring
to. Like life, okay? Now, we can debate the finer tuned, off the fringes, what is life? Like, what is a virus and where did life happen? But you take the circle of the tree of life and environmental ecology of living things, and you ask a biologist, what are you about? It's like, well, I want to study all that crap, right? And then a chemist goes underneath that and says, well, actually, the structure of matter, and then geologists know what they're about, and physics go down to energy, matter across the sphere, and everybody's, we can debate the fine, but you get into psychology. Well, it's the subject of conscious experience of being. Well, actually, can you do that scientifically? No, it's actually behavior. Well, actually, no, it's the mind. No, actually, the mind of animals? Well, where's the mind of man? Actually, no, it's really an identity that fosters well-being. You mean it's not a science after all? It's more like medicine, rather. Yeah, blah, blah. Okay, whatever. It just is. Go get a major. Actually, it's one of the most popular majors. Just go get a major in it.
Yeah.
So the coherence of our world is at this epicenter of this thing called psychology, and yet it breaks down completely, whereby the thing beneath it, biology, has clear ontological reference. We go into neuroscience, got a pretty clear ontological reference all the way down. Why? Why is that? And I discovered that actually there's a thing called the enlightenment gap, which is an even bigger problem than the problem of psychology, and that is, as science broke off, we couldn't figure out how to put mind back in the ontological equation. And we couldn't figure out how to align science with subjective and social knowing. That's the enlightenment gap. So there's epistemological and ontological problem. Okay? If we go back to Wilber and the question, the lines that Wilber gives us has a cool angle, but not a precise angle. Okay? Wilber doesn't solve the problem of psychology. He
Interesting.
doesn't. Okay? He glosses it over. And quite frankly, as much as I love him, Zach's system is vulnerable to this problem as well. Okay? You don't solve the problem of psychology, you're going to have a fuzzy ontology. Okay? That's UTOK. And only UTOK solves this problem. Okay? And what it does is it clarifies our ontology and then puts the subjective and social epistemological frames, i.e. interior ones, in right relationship to the scientific exterior. So it's essentially Integral 2.0 with a better, more precisely academically refined definition and conception of scientific ontology and the interior-exterior individual collective epistemology, and gives you frameworks for stitching what Wilber together saw, but he didn't actually resolve.
Very interesting. Yeah, I do remember in, I think it's Integral Spirituality, he has a very complex sort of epistemological breakdown of the quadrants, and then there's sort of an inside and an outside of each of the four quadrants. It gets very complex, but...
Well, right, you got to find where you are on Wilber's development, Wilber 2.0, whatever, but I have a whole blog that actually argues that Wilber equates the exterior quadrants with a matter ontology.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And that's wrong. Turns out that's wrong.
Yeah. Interesting.
At least according to UTOK, that's an error. I can point to the error. I can fix the error. And when you fix the error, you're like, oh my God, he's seeing super cool things. But actually, this is a lot more refined and clear than Wilber's confusion.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I do. I actually started reading your 2022 book. I think it's on the problem of psychology. What is the title of it again?
It's a new synthesis for solving the problem of psychology, addressing the enlightenment gap. I just explained what the enlightenment gap is. And the argument basically is this is what psychology is. And you can go read Wilber. He doesn't ever really talk about the problem of psychology. He basically just grabs it, does a survey, says it's sort of confusing. Here are all an integral, he takes all the developmental lines, does a really nice job. But his terminology around cognition and emotion and all of this actually is the cluster of psychology, the cluster F of psychology in terms of what these actual terms mean. There's no good descriptive metaphysics yet for Wilber to map it. UTOK gives us that.
Yeah. And it's so interesting as an outsider, just looking at this field. I mean, many people critique the field of psychology because of, for example, replication crisis. Oh, we have a bunch of data that's not right. But you're saying the problem is so much more fundamental. We have this very relatively young science, maybe 150 years, and we don't even really know the subject matter of what we're talking about, and basic definitions of mind, behavior, etc.
Totally.
Like, this is a big issue.
Be wary about the young science. Okay, that's a line that you want to be cautious of. Okay, and I say that because it's sort of like genetics is way younger than psychology.
That's true.
So it's material science, really.
Yeah,
but they don't have this problem. Okay, so there is a deeper problem. And the real problem is getting the academy to wake up to what the actual problem is. And this is why nobody pays attention to me at all. I'm an academic that's waving a flag over here in the dark, in the already denied space. So what actually I spell out in the book is there's this enlightenment gap problem, which actually is a philosophical problem. And what we actually need is a new descriptive metaphysical system for talking about the world. That's what we need, according to this. A new descriptive metaphysics. Now, I'm a scientist. Back in the day, if somebody told me, well, you need a descriptive metaphysics for learning about... I'd be, metaphysics? Oh my God, that's philosophical bullshit. Angels on the head of a pin. Nobody worries about metaphysics. That's the dumbest that's what they tried to do. That's what science fixed, right? Galileo hated scholastic metaphysics, and we get science because we realize it's time to evolve from metaphysical speculation. It is the case that there's pure metaphysics that can go that way. But metaphysics really just means the concepts and categories that you use to map the world and the fundamental assumptions for your ontology and your epistemology. So if you're actually claiming as a scientist that you understand the world and that you use terms that reference things empirically in the world, then you better understand that you're using a metaphysical system. What is behavior, friends? What is mind? And what is science relative to the profession? If you can't answer that, you are lacking a coherent descriptive metaphysical system, and you really don't deserve to be called a scientist. You're a parroting operator who gains empirical data and makes claims in a complete vacuum or abyss of conceptual understanding. No wonder we got a replication crisis. It's embarrassing as hell. You don't even know your terms. Okay, so yeah, I'm basically saying you guys don't know what the F we're talking about. I was one of you. We actually need to know what the F we're talking about. But that doesn't mean we need more studies and p-values that are more refined with better methodology to correct we actually need to know what we mean by mind, consciousness, cognition, behavior, and the self. Those are called the big five. It's like, do you know what you mean by those terms? We know we don't. I know you don't. I studied it. You guys don't know what you mean. And that's a problem. You should advertise that, and there's a better way to go.
Yeah. It's incredible. And do you know of any other scholars? There must be some out there that have diagnosed this problem, that have seen it and have, raised awareness about it. But you're saying it's being ignored. It's a bit taboo, maybe.
So that's why you need to know the history, or you're doomed to repeat it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or rhyme with it at least. Okay. So as psychology gets its standing, so it's late 1800s. Okay. Birth of the field's 1879. The first primary reference for psychology is what's behind your eyes. That's what people are thinking, okay? And Wilhelm Wundt develops introspection, systematic process by which we're going to study the process by which people have perceptions and can report on them. That's the first really field, okay? But doing science with only one observer that you can't intersubjectively connect in a way that's trying to measure qualia, which actually the original model of science basically gets rid of, okay, is really tricky.
Yeah.
And he fails because there are other ways to look at it. William James says, no, it's not the structure of consciousness. It's mental life. It's the functional ways in which animals and humans adapt to the world, what he calls mental life, which is basically the best definition. William James is the greatest earliest psychologist in my understanding. But mental life doesn't get precisely defined because he actually anchors it to consciousness as like, oh, it's controlled by, regulated, a manifestation of. And then we get people like Sigmund Freud, not B.F. Skinner, Sigmund Freud come along. Actually, a lot of mental life, and James sort of knew this but was weak with it, is unconscious.
Yeah.
There's a huge amount of unconscious mental life. So consciousness can't be mental life if there's a huge amount of unconscious mental life. And then you have the Watsonian behaviors that say actually it's all bullshit at the level of everything stimulus response. We can experimentally analyze stimulus response and use the methods of science to reduce down the physiological stack to set a network of stimulus response reflexes. That's what behaviorism was. Those are all different things. The behavior of animals studied in a lab, the adaptive processes of humans and animals, the human subjective conscious experience being, and the unconscious shit that causes people to be neurotic. Those are just four of the schools of thought. So when a great psychologist, Lev Vygotsky, comes along and other people, in 1899, this gets diagnosed as the crisis and becomes well known in the field as the crisis, which is exactly what I call the problem. Excuse me, these are all different things.
Yeah.
Even any person that looks at this can say this is different things. This gives rise to the crisis in psychology. So historically, any historian of psychology will come and tell you, well, has anyone done this before? It's called the history. I mean, the crisis in history, that's its term. And you can study, you can read the crisis. And everybody's been aware of the crisis. What you need to understand is they decided it couldn't be solved. So the institution already decided that that's a bad way of framing it. And the only way to make psychology a science is not through ontology. They'll tell you, well, some narcissistic need to know everything. Really kill his father. Gregg has a fundamental need. That's what's really driving Gregg, is his fundamental need to show his father that he's really smart. And so he creates this autistic model of that supersedes everybody and thinks he's really a genius and he solves a problem that can't be solved. Yeah. That's what the only way you solve it is through the hard-won knocks of empirical data and behavioral science. And so it's the methods of psychology that make it a science. Okay, and we study behavior, which is accessible through science, and we infer mental process if you're a traditional scientist, and you draw models of mental process. What exactly are mental processes again? Well, whatever you say they are, that are regulating your behavior. Well, are they conscious? Are they self-conscious? Are they just neurocognitive phenomena? Whatever. No one can answer that question. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And that's so the question is, the huge problem isn't, did the field never know this? Of course they knew it. They then entered into denial, developed a rationalization that was important. So the real challenge is we have an institution that's already devoted to the fact that it doesn't matter. So that's why they can ignore it. And then went down the whole path of methods-based science without realizing that actual coherence-based science, i.e. a descriptive metaphysics that makes sense, is actually important. You have an entire generations of psychologists who have been taught it's empiricism, not metaphysics, you idiot. And then I realized, oh my God, this whole theory is empirical, metaphysical, empirical dialectic. It's actually unique concepts and categories that organize empiricism, both scientific empiricism, which is, by the way, third person exterior, aka if we go to Wilber, and first person interior and collective interior. Actually, all those are actually empirical and epistemological angles. That's the beauty of Wilber. It's like, actually, if you're going to want a holistic view, you better tie together different epistemologies. Okay. And Wilber sees the general line. He sees the epistemological structure. It's all outline. Fact of the matter is there's still serious problems that he doesn't know how to resolve. UTOK can develop an Integral 2.0, and it resolves those problems and then advances that vision with a lot more precision.
Wow. Such a fascinating history. And one of the things that makes me wonder is, what are some of the practical implications of this problem, especially for our understanding of well-being? Like, I can imagine if you have this basic confusion in the science of psychology, then how can we get a coherent understanding of well-being? You have a model of well-being yourself, the nested model. I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that. Like, how does this bleed into the actual reality of, the world?
Totally. Well, that's, what is well-being? You know it when you see it. It's like porn, in the Supreme Court. Basically. I know it when I see it. And that's basically how well we've done. And then you divide it up and all these other things. One of the things UTOK comes with, it comes with 4. So it's metapsychology, is the unified theory of psychology, unified approach. And there's 4 different ideas. One is CASH, you mentioned, wheel of development, which is basically a Wilberian way of thinking at one level across lines. It just creates categories. It says, well, there's actually identity, there's abilities and talents, there's challenges, pathologies that actually develop, there's traits, you got to consider those, and you have to consider values and virtues. And then the next is this, what is well-being? Okay. And so I'm able to take UTOK. The cool thing about what UTOK does is it says that actually you bring the meta-psychology of UTOK's lens, and it complexifies and coheres psychology. And what that means is it integrates, differentiates, and creates metastable patterns of concepts. Okay? Like CAST, it's not the different schools of thought, behaviorism, emotion-focused therapy, psychodynamics, and cognitive. It's actually systems of adaptation that can lead to habits, emotions, relationships, defenses, and justifications. That's the issue. And once you have that, you really see it's a complexified whole, not different schools of thought. Okay? It does the same thing with well-being. It says actually people have been confused about well-being. What is it? Okay? And it says actually when you take UTOK, you say, okay, actually there's the subjective experience of being, which actually psychologists have figured out how to measure pretty well. And it differentiates those. Your primate system, okay, across states and traits, which are basically positive and negative affect across states and traits. That's what your primate system basically is doing. Emotion, evaluating where you are over time at trait level or in the situation state level. That's one core. So that's your affective element. Okay. Then you have a generalized cognitive function, which basically says, hey, how satisfied are you on a scale of 1 to 10? We've built lots of measurements that give pretty good arguments about, well, if you say a 0 versus say a 10, that makes a difference, although we have to qualify it. And then within your categories of identity, you say what's important to you, then you narrow down the specific fields. Okay, so like, oh, my job's really important to me, or my faith is really important, my relationships, you get money, etc. I mean, if we get a map from a first person perspective, overall affect, state, and trait, general identity, and then specific identity across these scales is a pretty good measure. Okay, you can get a, and then you want to nest that into the actual. So that's the first person vantage point. Then you nest that in essentially a doctor level analysis, and by that I mean both physician doctors, biological doctors that can then assess the biological, physiological, anatomy, organismic, structural, functional health. And then a psychological doctor like me that can say, okay, what's the personality trait structure? What's the cognitive memory structure? What's the basic structure in which the identity is functioning? What's its defenses, etc.? So what's its personality functioning from an outside point of view? So you get that at the psychosocial, at the level of the individual. Then you nest all of that in the environment, both at the level of the material environment, how many toxins, how much noise, how much are they degrading the system, what's the level. And then you higher order it into society through relations, how are you connecting, what's the financial system, what's the overall socio-political context, how does that relate into larger structures. That's pretty good overall, but you're not quite done, because actually well-being is an evaluative concept. Okay, to have its utility, it means we're making bad well-being is almost by definition something we want to avoid. Good well-being. What does that actually mean? And I use the example of the healthy Nazi. Okay, so the healthy Nazi in 1942 building Auschwitz, he's great. Everything's wonderful. He's really, really working well. Okay, but wait a minute. Okay, the long-term view of that and across. So then we have to nest all of this in a set of values. So the nested model of well-being, and then when you think about it again, as something, yeah, of course that just makes sense. Right? It's like, oh, there's values that we have. There's an environment, there's a biopsychological context that a doctor can view, and there's this individual subject view. You align all that, and positive well-being is the growth alignment of all the positive functions. And then mental illness actually is essentially the reverse. The dysfunction, distress associated with the subjective, the functional at the organismic and psychological levels, the environment, and then the values that we have. So it's the first review I got on that was, when we're doing peer review, this got published, and this is so obvious that we don't even need it. And I wrote to the editor and said, if it's so obvious, why can I do this lit review and not find anybody say it? And my editor wrote back and said, it's a good point. I'm publishing that thing. Good argument. Right? If it's so obvious, then it should be there. So that's a good example of what it tries to do. So, that's the nested model of well-being. That's the seventh, the third insight and unified approach, seventh overall as part of the metapsychology.
Yeah. Yeah, it's such a cool model, especially in the book. You have a beautiful, image of it as well with the what's this person's name, the illustrator?
Christian Gross, who did such a beautiful job in my illustrations. Yes.
Yeah, they looked amazing. Yeah, totally. I'm just looking at the time. I'm wondering how you're doing for time.
I'm good. I'll let you take the lead on where you feel like we are.
Yeah. Just curious. Let me see. I had a bunch of things written down. Always over prepared.
That's been lovely, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been lovely. Maybe I'm very interested in whether you think that some of this knowledge you've described, some of these common core processes in psychotherapy, etc., would it be a good idea to try and integrate these things into school curricula, that somehow kids just by default learn these basic things about the human mind and how to, alleviate the suffering, prevent the arising of psychopathology, rather than treating them after years of suffering and then you go to a clinician? I know that Zach Stein and others have some reservations about the education system and the way it's currently structured. Maybe you don't want to, keep that thing going in the way that it's currently built up. But I'm curious if you have thoughts on that.
I mean, I'll put it, we can do so much better. I mean, my kids went through their educational K through 12. I don't think they got 1 hour on what an emotion is. Okay. I mean, wow. Right.
Yeah.
Now, be very aware, my friend John Vervaeke, we did the thing with Zach Stein with, it's like the language of training is very different than the language of explaining. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So me as a psychological doctor saying, what is emotion? What's emotional health? And how should I manifest? It's very different than my mom was a kindergarten teacher. She's got to figure out how to manifest that with kindergartners. Okay. And you don't want to ask me as a psychological doctor who only treats adults, well, how do what are 5-year-olds? Well, the first thing you want to let them do is to think about, label their feelings and talk it through and ask you don't do that with 5-year-olds.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I'm aware enough about that. Okay. Yeah. So then you can take the principles, right? What are the principles? And then you actually go to Lev Vygotsky's one, great developmental, and certainly Zach, I appreciate. And Lev Vygotsky taught us about the zone of proximal development, and that you need a wise elder to take perspective and to metabolize the tools of the culture through the lens of the wise elder to develop a form of life that is developmentally conducive to where you are and where you might go in the future. Okay, that's zone of proximal development. So we need a teacher. My mom was an outstanding kindergarten teacher, a Disney award-winning teacher nationally, and she could read what kids needed, right? And then I can then tell you, well, what my mom's actually doing is she is reflecting back, demonstrating, and creating a little appropriate space for the kid to have some expression of emotion and then to regulate it. She's giving them loving support while also challenging them, okay? And then navigating a play-based environment where they're exploring and their autonomy is well met, okay? And what should be happening by the time my kids are in high school is that everyone should have had a course on what a neurotic loop is and when your identity's coming online and it's just this raw little new thing when you're 12 and you got a real attitude and blah, blah, blah. And we need people who are super knowledgeable about cultivating healthy adolescent development. Again, I'm an adult person, so that gives them the language of what an ego is. Like, okay, dude, both in terms of, dude, that's my ego, and dude, that's the part of you that actually narrating yourself. And why do we see so much mental health problems come online with adolescents? is because the horse now rider relationship is actually differentiated, and the identity comes on, and it has all of these secondary ideas about mom and dad, and about being popular, and about who I really wish I was relative to who I actually am. I'm kind of chubby, and I'm not really an athlete, and I'm not very popular, and why don't I just sit online and do all this other stuff, and I'll watch porn? Okay, well, that's trouble, right? That's trouble for the identity. So all of this stuff should be embedded in the family, in the society, in the schools. There's a particular wisdom for training education, okay, and explaining. And the right bridge between those is the right dance. And do we do that well? Absolutely not. Okay, I don't do that well at all. In fact, I think we do it at times looking at the mental health crisis.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, ouch, not well, not an A+ on that account.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always struck me as bizarre as a child that I never learned anything about this. And similarly, I didn't learn anything about how to cultivate a healthy lifestyle, for example, like nutrition. I think I had maybe half an hour on nutrition ever. How do you cultivate healthy sleep, exercise, all these things, habit change? How do I even do that? How do I change a habit? Didn't learn a thing.
And the real danger, and I don't know if we're going to grow out of this, crash and burn and grow up, but it is this bridge, the sensibilities that we have on bridging, knowing what we then learn to give us affordances and knowing what we actually are forgetting too. Okay. Yeah. So like there's a great study that looked at depression in indigenous populations. Did 2,000 people. This guy interviewed accordingly with systematic measurements. You know how many depressed people he found among indigenous people out of 2,000?
One. Amazing.
Okay.
Amazing.
So why? Because the language of training is actually embedded to be connected to nature in a community that works together, in the way in which that structure, that's what our natures are sort of, and they fit our natures, our primate natures, into the natural world in a way that we don't know how to do. And they don't, and this whole idea that you can then abstract. I mean, brilliant physics developments, right? Okay, brilliant developments in physics. But, oh, by the way, this means you're really just a bag of chemicals and your life has no meaning. Not good, right? not a good translation to the life. And I've encountered that. I went to college and realized I was just a bunch of chemicals. Oh, my God. How do we transfer our knowledge? UTOK actually, with its system, affords us clarity, I believe, on the subjective, the cultural, and the scientific, and gives us the kind of picture that affords clarity and says, hey, we got to incorporate the wisdom of culture, incorporate the reality, the phenomenology, and incorporate science. The question is how. We have a way of doing that. We haven't done it very well, and we see a lot of crises associated with it, I think, downstream from that failure. Yeah,
totally. And I remember talking to a few people who've actually attempted to do this, to sort of really reform education. There's a wonderful nonprofit called Charity Entrepreneurship that tries to look at the most cost-effective interventions you could do to improve well-being across the world. And one of the things they almost recommended was to try and lobby for positive education. So this is like implementing positive psychology, sort of Seligman's 5, positive emotion, engagement, meaning, relationships, and achievement, PERMA, to try and somehow implement that in education. And they said, it could potentially be very good. But in terms of, how tractable that is, they were very pessimistic. And almost everyone I've talked to so far was like, education is one of the most conservative institutions. If you want to get something actually in the curriculum, you're looking at years and years of hard work and probably not see any results anytime soon. It would still be worth it maybe, but yeah.
Well, I believe we're at a very important inflection point in this world, and UTOK is actually it positions itself as sort of a transformation system across our knowledge. And there's the formal aspect of education, which is basically creating knowledgeable, enlightened citizens, and then utilizing knowledge to do that. I think our knowledge systems suck relative to the structure, okay? If we had better knowledge systems, or at least that's what UTOK's claim, obviously I'm biased when I say here's your better knowledge systems, then we can do better in relationship to how we would organize and scaffold this. How to do that at the genuine engineering level, like, okay, here's where education currently is. These are all of the regulations conservatively. I mean, my mom was like, I'd never be a teacher now. Okay.
Oh, really?
Precisely because, she was like, the way in which the top-down bureaucracy And if you know anything about collapse, by the way, what happens is bureaucracy gets more and more top heavy, tries to regulate more and more, and actually creates a blood-sucking disaster. And that's really, so how I am a theorist, I have no idea how you'd actually leverage the actual societal institution, instill an educational training system that does justice to the explaining system. All I can say is, I would say this in a really short way, teach people neurotic loops and get COM-MO flashlights out there.
Yeah.
That's it. And just, I do, at one point when I'm ready to like do grants, I'd write a grant for $10,000, okay? And I would ship COM-MO flashlights with like a little paragraph description just of what they are. And that's it. Just send them to the thing. No, that's it. And then distribute them. And then some kids get them, some don't. Then they wonder what they are, and then they have a little, what's a neurotic loop, what's a flashlight, can you plan, and then no curriculum, just drop that in there, right?
Yeah.
And then see if you drop in COM-MO flashlights in a little bit, do you know what a neurotic loop is? You know what a flashlight is? You know how to shine it. That's it. Hey kid, that to me is the way I would do it. Notice that's a non-institutional, of course everyone, are you allowed to do that? It's like, one of the nice things about COM-MO is that in terms of side effects, we're not instilling SSRIs in our kids, okay, folks? Why I was a huge critic of, and while Zach Stein being a bigger critic of the medication disaster, right? We're going to actually tinker with the neurobiological structures because these behaviors are annoying in the societal context. Nice job, guys, psychiatry, and the educational control structure that Zach is brilliant at delineating as a disaster. But I always said, so UTOK said, ship them COM-MO flashlights, say, hey kid, shine your light on COM-MO, on neurotic loops, and then it's out. I'll let educators deal with their societal structures and everything else. The argument is that that's a reasonable bomb in a system that needs it, and then you get to really fix the engineering. That's not I'm a theorist.
Yeah. Well, if you ever do a course on COM-MO in the future, I'm definitely going to sign up on that.
Okay,
it sounds great.
Well, look, in 2005, we're actually totally looking to set that up in 2005. So I'll make sure to include you on the email. Wonderful.
Yeah. Maybe just a closing thought. I participated a few years ago in a teacher training for cultivating emotional balance. It's this program created by Paul Ekman. You're probably familiar.
Of course.
Kind of in a sense making the same argument, like we're not teaching people basic things about what are emotions, how do I regulate them, how can I have a better relationship with that. And what struck me there is it's a 42-hour program, which is quite long, and they did an RCT on it, which showed meaningful improvements, but still one RCT is not exactly a huge evidence base. It's just, I'm trying to find something out there that would be scalable, but it's hard to find. So, yeah.
Well, we think, so neurotic loops, emotional sweet spot, COM-MO, and the basic structure of your cognitive. We don't even do CAS. We basically do, there's a public self, a private self, and an experiential self. Why does that get bumped? What's an emotional sweet spot? How do you hold awareness and attunement? How do you adaptively regulate? Why would you want to do that? Value states of being. What traps that? Neurotic loops. How do you reverse those? COM-MO flashlight. That's it. That's the ingredients. You can learn that very quickly. I would argue 10 hours really gets you proficiency. And then you can assess, like next time you were bumped on a bruise, meaning what's your vulnerability? Do you know what that is? Last time you were bumped, did you immediately shift into sage mode? And did that help?
Yeah.
There you go. So I'm totally with you at the level of, oh my God, how much efficiency is super key. We have nailed this thing, I think, down, and we're ready to then figure out how to get it into the language of training for sure.
That's so cool. All right. I mean, maybe that's a good place to end. Just looking at the time, it's been a blast. I really enjoyed this. And thank you so much for taking the time. And if there's anything you'd like to do it.
Yeah, well, I mean, let me just celebrate, Integral is a system that I think is certainly a cousin to UTOK. So I appreciate, like I said, I think UTOK shares a lot of affinity, bridging East and West and things along those lines. So, and well-being, the mental health of our children, folks. And let's not overcomplicate it, right? It's basically bad shit happens and we have trouble coping and accepting, and then we get bitter and fragile. And it's like, that's totally understandable. We love people that do that. But at the same time, you can learn that secondary reaction. You swap out that critical reactivity for a calm responsivity, and things will be better. We know that empirically. The question is, how do we do that in our lives, with ourselves, with each other? If we do, we'll have a lot more well-being for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. So, I mean, where can people find your work? What would be the best place for them to follow?
Yeah, so we have a brand new website, like I think I mentioned. We have a newsletter. I'll send out, make sure a link if anybody wants to sign up for our newsletter. We
Great.
have what's called the UTOK Circle. About 250 people hang out, dialoguing about UTOK. And we're hoping that this next year, so we got the book out, we'll do the website. Now we're really in a place, I think we were sort of ahead of the curve when we tried to do the course. We didn't have enough materials. People aren't really sure what it is. It's now consolidated, UTOK is, with the book. And yeah, really applied stuff here with COM-MO, flashlights on neurotic loops, and clarifying the common core psychotherapy. We can do that now. We'll share that with folks and see what they think.
That would be great. Looking forward to it.
All right.
All right.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
You too. All right. Have a great day.
You too.